The door of the Silver Spur saloon crashed open so hard that the hinges screamed, and Clara Jane stepped backward into the night air with her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged animal trying to break free. "You don't walk away from this arrangement, girl." Harlan Moss's voice was low and dangerous, the kind of low that precedes a storm. He stood in the doorway, blocking the lamplight, his silhouette enormous and wrong. "Your father signed the papers. You belong to me as of tomorrow morning." Clara's breath came in ragged pulls. She had run 3 miles through the dark to reach Caldwell's Creek, had stolen a horse from her father's stable and ridden it half to death over rocky terrain. And she was standing now in the main street of a town she barely knew, in the year 1882, in Texas, with nowhere left to go and no one left to call her own. "I signed nothing," she said, and her voice only shook a little. "You don't need to sign anything." Harlan stepped down from the porch. He was 47 years old, thick through the chest, with a face that had been carved by cruelty into something almost resembling authority. "Your father owed me $4,000. You're the settlement. Simple as arithmetic." The street around them was not empty. Men had started drifting out of the saloon to watch. Women pressed their faces to window glass. Nobody moved to help her, and Clara understood in that crystalline, horrible moment what it meant to be utterly alone in the world. She took another step back. Her heel caught on a loose board and she stumbled, catching herself on the hitching post with both hands, the rough wood biting into her palms. "You come with me now," Harlan said, "and I won't tell your father you stole his horse." A new voice cut through the night air like a blade through silk. "The lady seems disinclined to go anywhere with you, Moss." Every head turned. He was standing at the far end of the street, having come from the direction of the sheriff's office, and he walked with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never once in his life needed to rush toward danger, because danger had always eventually found its way to him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair that curled slightly at the temples and eyes that caught the torchlight from the saloon's exterior lanterns and held it. The star on his chest caught it too. Sheriff Grant Calloway stopped 10 feet from Harlan Moss and looked at him with the patient, measuring expression of a man who has already decided how a situation is going to end. "This is none of your business, Sheriff," Harlan said. "Everything that happens on this street is my business." Grant's voice was calm. "And right now what's happening on this street is that you're frightening a young woman who clearly does not wish to be in your company." Clara stood between them, her pulse thundering, and thought, "I have never seen anything like him in my life." That was the moment everything changed. But to understand how she had come to be standing in that street, how she had come to be desperate enough to steal a horse and ride into the dark, and how Grant Calloway had come to be the kind of man who would walk toward trouble without flinching, you had to go back to the beginning. Clara Jane had grown up in Marston, Texas, a town about 15 miles east of Caldwell's Creek, and she had grown up knowing 2 things about her father: that he loved her, and that he was a coward about money. Robert Jane had been a rancher once, genuinely successful, with good cattle and good land, and a reputation for fair dealing. Clara's mother, Ellen, had been alive then, and the ranch had felt like a place where real life happened, where people laughed over supper and argued companionably about whether to plant more corn along the eastern fence line, and where Clara had learned to ride almost before she learned to walk. Ellen Jane had died in the winter of 1876, when Clara was 16, and something had gone out of Robert Jane that never came back. He started making bad decisions. Small ones first, the kind that could be excused as bad luck, then larger ones. He sold sections of land that he should have held. He invested in a silver mine that produced nothing but dust and legal fees. He borrowed money at ruinous interest rates from men who were not in the business of being understanding about repayment. Harlan Moss was one of those men. By the spring of 1882, when Clara was 22, her father owed Harlan Moss a sum so large that the ranch itself, the cattle, the equipment, every asset Robert Jane had managed to keep, would not cover it. Harlan had come to supper 3 weeks ago and made his proposal over a table that Clara had set with her own hands, while her father sat at the head of it and said nothing. "Clara is a fine-looking girl," Harlan had said, conversationally, as if he were discussing a horse at auction. "She'll make a decent wife. I've been without one for 6 years. The debt gets cleared and the ranch passes to me anyway at the end of it. I'm offering generous terms." Clara had stood in the kitchen doorway and heard every word. She had looked at her father across the room, had looked at his face and watched him not meet her eyes. He had signed the papers 2 days later. Clara had not screamed. She had not made a scene. She had cried privately and thoroughly in the bedroom that had been hers since she was a child. And then she had dried her face and started making a different kind of plan. She was her mother's daughter in at least one way. When the world showed you clearly what it intended to do to you, you did not wait for it to do it. She had taken 3 days to prepare. She had packed a single canvas bag with the things that mattered: her mother's locket, a change of clothes, the small amount of cash she had saved over years of selling eggs and mended garments in Marston's Market. She had waited for the night before the arrangement was to be finalized, when her father was drinking himself unconscious in the parlor, as he often did now. And she had gone to the stable and taken the chestnut mare her father called Red, because Red was the fastest horse on the property, and Clara was not interested in being caught. She had ridden west because west was where she had never been, where nobody knew her name, where the darkness of the open range felt like freedom instead of danger. She had ridden hard for 3 hours, and then walked the horse for 1, alternating pace, keeping the mare from breaking down, thinking with the clear, cold practicality of someone who has decided that survival matters more than sentiment. She had reached Caldwell's Creek just after midnight and had ridden straight up the main street because she was too tired and too frightened to be strategic. And that was when Harlan Moss had stepped out of the Silver Spur Saloon. He had arrived that same evening. She had not known it, could not have predicted it, but Harlan Moss had not been content to wait for morning like a gentleman. He had come to retrieve his property early. He had ridden to the Jane ranch and found Clara gone, and his fury had been incandescent and immediate. He had ridden west himself, following what he imagined her logic to be, and he had been right, which brought them to the street, to that moment, to Grant Calloway walking toward them with his badge catching torchlight and his voice carrying the weight of a man who intended to be obeyed. "Moss," Grant said, "I'm going to ask you one time to get back on your horse and ride back to wherever you came from tonight. Whatever arrangement you believe you have, it doesn't give you the right to chase a woman through the night and corner her in my town. It's a legal contract, Sheriff." Harlan's voice had taken on a different quality now, cautious but still dangerous. "Signed by her father. She's in breach of it. Then you can bring your contract to the county courthouse in the morning and let Judge Patterson sort it out." Grant stopped directly beside Clara, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel the solid warmth of him like a wall she could lean against if she needed to. "For tonight, you're done here." Something moved across Harlan's face that Clara could not quite name. He was calculating. She had watched him calculate before, and it always preceded something unpleasant. "This isn't finished, Sheriff," Harlan said. "Most things aren't," Grant replied pleasantly. "Good night, Mr. Moss." There was a long moment in which the night held its breath, and then Harlan Moss turned and walked back into the saloon, and the watchers drifted away, and Clara realized she was shaking from her heels to her crown. Grant turned to look at her, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No," she swallowed. "He didn't touch me. He only just found me." "Where were you headed?" It was a reasonable question, and she had no reasonable answer. "Away," she said honestly. "I was headed away from him." He studied her for a moment with those steady eyes, and she had the disorienting sensation of being seen clearly by someone who was not trying to take anything from her in the seeing. "Come with me," he said. "I'll explain the options." The sheriff's office was a solid, no-nonsense building on the east side of Caldwell's Creek's Main Street, with 2 jail cells in the back that were empty tonight, a scarred wooden desk, a rack of rifles on the wall, and a small iron stove that Grant coaxed to life while Clara sat in the single chair that was not the one behind the desk, and wrapped her hands around a tin cup of coffee that he produced with the competent efficiency of a man accustomed to making do. He explained the situation with an admirably direct plainness. "A contract of that nature is not enforceable by law in the state of Texas. A woman cannot be bartered in settlement of a debt. The courts have been clear about that, though not everyone has received the message." He sat on the corner of his desk and folded his hands. "However, if your father has signed documents that appear to convey property rights, Moss can tie up the ranch in litigation for years. He has money for lawyers, and your father apparently does not." "My father," Clara said carefully, "signed those papers willingly." Grant looked at her for a moment. "I'm sorry." "He loves me," she said, and she was surprised to find that she believed it. "He's just afraid. He's been afraid for a long time, and Harlan Moss knows how to use afraid people." "Where are you planning to go?" She looked at the coffee in her hands. "I don't know anyone in Caldwell's Creek. I don't know anyone west of Marston, honestly. I have a small amount of money, and I have the horse I borrowed from my father's stable, which he may or may not report stolen." She paused. "What are my options?" He was quiet for a moment. She appreciated that he did not rush to fill the silence with false reassurance. "The hotel has rooms," he said, "but Moss will still be in town, and he'll be watching. The boarding house is run by a woman named Martha Crane, who is decent and discreet, but she'll talk, and in a town this size news travels faster than horses." He looked at his hands and then back at her. "I have a house." She looked up. "2 bedrooms," he said. "I'm rarely in it before midnight, and I'm gone by 6 in the morning. It's behind the jail, off the main street, not visible from the road unless you know it's there. Nobody in town would think to look for you there because it's not a place I generally bring visitors." He paused. "I'm offering it as a safe place to stay while we sort out the legal situation. Nothing more complicated than that." Clara studied him for a long moment. He held her gaze without flinching, and without the calculating quality that Harlan Moss's gaze had always carried, the quality of a man who is assessing an asset. Grant Calloway looked at her like she was a person who had a problem that he might be able to help solve. "Why?" she asked. He seemed to consider how to answer honestly. "Because what Moss is doing is wrong, and there isn't a law on the books that specifically forbids it tonight, and the law is supposed to protect people even when it has gaps in it." He paused. "And because you look like you've been riding scared through the dark for 3 hours, and you need somewhere safe to sleep." "You don't know me," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I know Harlan Moss, and I know the difference between a woman running from something and a woman running toward trouble." She thought about it for 1 minute exactly, and then she said, "All right." The house was small and spare and very clean, which surprised her. It had the quality of a place where a person lives practically rather than comfortably, where everything has a function and nothing is decorative, except for a single framed photograph on the mantelpiece that she did not examine that night. He showed her the bedroom, changed the bedding with a brisk efficiency that suggested he had done it before in circumstances that didn't allow for ceremony, left a towel and a bar of soap by the wash basin, and told her the door had a bolt on the inside. "I'll be in the office if you need anything," he said from the doorway. "You're not staying." "I'll sleep in the cell," he said, perfectly matter of fact. "The cot's not comfortable, but it's not the first time." She watched him leave, and then she sat on the edge of the bed and felt the adrenaline drain out of her all at once, leaving behind something that was not quite peace, but was adjacent to it. She was in a stranger's house in a town she had never been to before, with no plan beyond tomorrow morning, with a man she had known for 40 minutes having just offered her the most genuine kindness anyone had shown her in 6 years. She bolted the door. She changed her clothes. She lay down on the clean, spare bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about what her life had been and what it might still become. And she was asleep inside of 10 minutes. Grant did not sleep. He sat in his office chair and drank coffee, and thought about Harlan Moss, who he had known about for 2 years without having had sufficient cause to act on that knowledge. Moss was the kind of man who did terrible things within the technical boundaries of what was permissible, who understood the law the way a predator understands a fence, not as a moral barrier, but as an obstacle to be navigated. Grant had watched him do it to a family named Beringer in the spring of 1881, watched him take their land through a combination of debt and legal pressure that was perfectly legitimate on paper and perfectly shameful in every other sense. He thought about the woman in his house. Clara Jane. She had told him her name when he asked, in that tone of someone providing information they are not certain is safe to provide. 22 years old and riding alone through the Texas dark because the alternative was a forced marriage to a man 40 years her senior. The courage of it was something Grant could recognize and respect, having spent his entire adult life in the business of evaluating people's behavior under pressure. He had been sheriff of Caldwell's Creek for 4 years. Before that, he had worked as a deputy in Abilene, and before that, he had spent 2 years doing work he did not often discuss, tracking men across difficult country for a territorial marshal who believed that justice was more important than comfort. He was 31 years old, and he had seen a great many things, and he thought he was reasonably good at reading character. He thought Clara Jane had an extraordinary amount of it. He did not examine that thought too carefully. He was not in the habit of making reckless personal decisions, and she was a woman in a desperate situation who needed practical help, not complications. In the morning, he spoke to his deputy, a steady young man named Thomas who asked no questions and required no explanations, and arranged for the horse that Clara had ridden to be stabled and cared for. He went to the telegraph office and sent a message to a lawyer he trusted in Austin, a man named Everett Holt, who had done good work on cases involving exactly this kind of debt settlement arrangement, and who understood the relevant statutes. Then he went back to his house. Clara was awake, had been for some time by the look of it, and had done what he suspected she would do, which was make herself useful. The stove was going, there was coffee, and she had apparently found the flour in the cast iron skillet and produced a quantity of cornbread that was cooling on the windowsill. She was standing at the window looking out at the back of the property, at the small kitchen garden that had gone somewhat wild in the absence of consistent attention, and she turned when she heard him come in. She looked better in the daylight, less terrified. More herself, he suspected, than she had been the previous night, though he had no baseline for comparison. "I hope this is all right," she said, gesturing at the cornbread. "I needed something to do with my hands." "It's more than all right," he said honestly. "I don't cook. What do you eat?" "The diner on 2nd Street," he said. "Miss Hawkins. She keeps a plate for me most nights." Clara considered this. That's a lonely way to live. He looked at her for a moment, because nobody had said that to him before, or at least nobody had said it with that particular quality of straightforward observation rather than pity. "I suppose it is," he said. They ate the cornbread together at his kitchen table, which was the first time in 4 years he had sat at that table with another person, and he told her about the message to the lawyer in Austin and what he hoped it would produce, and she listened with intelligent attention, asking sharp questions that indicated she had been thinking through the legal dimensions herself. "Even if the contract is unenforceable," she said, "Moss can still come after the ranch through the debt. My father loses everything either way." "Yes," Grant said. "I won't lie to you about that." She accepted it with a slight nod, the expression of someone who has already processed a hard truth and does not need it softened. "My father made his choices. I've been trying to save him from the consequences of those choices for 6 years, and I'm done." She looked at her hands on the table. "Does that make me a bad person?" "No," Grant said. "It makes you a person who's been carrying someone else's weight for too long." She looked at him then with an expression he could not entirely read, something that was part surprise and part something more careful, more considered. "You're very direct," she said. "I've found it saves time," he replied. She almost smiled. It was the first time he had seen anything close to it on her face, and he found himself wanting to see it completed. The days that followed had a peculiar double quality to them, urgent and dangerous on one hand, quietly domestic on the other, and Grant found himself navigating between those two registers with the careful balance of a man crossing a narrow bridge over fast water. Harlan Moss did not leave town. That was the first complication. Grant had expected him to retreat to Marston and regroup, but Moss checked into the Caldwell's Creek Hotel and settled in with the implacable patience of a man who believes time is on his side. He did not cause trouble, which would have given Grant legitimate cause to run him out. He simply existed in the town with the heavy, ominous quality of a weather system that hasn't broken yet. Grant kept Clara's presence in his house quiet. This required the cooperation of Thomas, who was trustworthy, and the incuriosity of his neighbors, which was easier to maintain than one might think in a town where the sheriff's private house was generally understood to be none of anyone's business. Clara stayed away from the main street, which she found maddening after 3 days. "I'm going to go insane," she told him on the 4th morning, with a frankness that he was rapidly coming to recognize as fundamental to her character. "I need to walk somewhere. Early morning," he said. "Before the saloon crowd is up. I'll come with you." They walked before sunrise, out along the creek that gave the town its name, where the cottonwood trees grew thick, and the water moved with a sound like conversation. Clara walked fast, the pent-up energy of 4 days of confinement expressing itself in her pace, and Grant matched her without effort. She talked. He had noticed that she was quiet when she was anxious and talkative when she felt safe, and he was oddly moved by the fact that she felt safe enough with him to talk. She talked about her mother, about Ellen Jane, who had grown herbs in window boxes and had known the name of every bird in Texas, and had been teaching Clara to embroider when she died, the project still unfinished in a cedar box in Clara's canvas bag. She talked about the ranch and the horses, and what it had been like when it was good, the early mornings and the smell of hay and the particular way the light came across the eastern pasture in winter. She talked about the 6 years of watching her father diminish, trying to shore him up, trying to be enough, trying to be both daughter and son and manager and conscience for a man who had decided that the world owed him better than what it had given him. Grant listened the way he did everything, with complete attention and without judgment. "What about you?" she asked eventually, stopping to watch a heron stand motionless in the shallow water. "Where are you from?" "Missouri," he said. "Originally, my parents had a farm outside of Kansas City." "Do they still?" "They died when I was 17, he said. "Influenza. It came through the whole region that winter." She turned to look at him with the direct, full attention expression that he was learning was her default when something mattered to her. "I'm sorry," she said. "Were you alone after that?" "I had a brother," Grant said, "older by 4 years. He took on the farm. We didn't agree about much." He paused. "I left at 18, went south, ended up in Abilene and found out I was good at keeping the peace." "Is that all it was?" "Finding out you were good at something." He considered it honestly. "No," he said. "I think I needed something to do with the fact that I couldn't protect my parents. The disease wasn't something I could have stopped, but at 17 you don't reason that way. You just feel that you failed." He looked at the heron. "Being a lawman is about protecting. I think that mattered to me." She was quiet for a moment. "We're somewhat alike," she said. "How do you mean?" "We both spent a long time trying to protect people who couldn't ultimately be protected." She looked back at the water. "And we're both very much alone." He did not answer that immediately because it required him to acknowledge a truth he had been managing to avoid for several years. "I suppose we are," he said. The heron took flight suddenly, all elegant angles and gray wings, rising over the cottonwoods and disappearing into the early light. The lawyer's reply arrived from Austin on the 6th day. Grant read it twice and then went to the house. Clara was in the kitchen garden, which she had been quietly rehabilitating over the past 4 days with a focus and a precision that he found himself watching with more enjoyment than he could easily justify. She had her sleeves rolled and her hair up, and she was pulling weeds with the thorough, systematic approach of someone who finds satisfaction in making order out of disorder. She looked up when he came through the back gate and read his expression immediately. She was very good at that, he had noticed. "Good news or bad?" she asked. "Complicated," he said, and handed her the letter. She read it standing right there, with the dirt still on her hands and her hair coming loose from its pins in the morning wind, and he watched the expressions move across her face as she worked through the legal language. Careful, attentive, occasionally tightening at something she didn't like, occasionally relaxing at something she did. "So the contract is unenforceable," she said when she finished. "And if Moss tries to present it as legally binding in court, he's committing fraud. But the debt itself is real, and the property lien is real, and my father is going to lose the ranch." "Yes." "And Moss will find out that the contract is unenforceable before he can force me to honor it, which means there's nothing legally compelling me to go back." She looked at the letter again. "But he's not going to accept that quietly." "No," Grant agreed. "He's not a man who accepts things quietly." She handed the letter back. "What do you think he'll do?" "I think he'll try to find leverage. He'll look for something to hold over you or over me. He may try to force your father to sign something different." Grant folded the letter carefully. "He may try something less legal." She met his eyes steadily. "He's dangerous when he's frustrated." "I know." Grant paused. "Has he been violent before?" Something moved across her face. Not quite fear, more like the memory of it. "He hit a man named Croft in Marston for failing to pay a debt on time. He has a man who works for him, name of Decker, who handles matters that Moss doesn't want associated with his name." She paused. "Decker arrived in Caldwell's Creek yesterday." Grant went very still. "How do you know that?" "Thomas told me this morning when he brought the newspaper." "He thought I should know." She looked at him with those clear, serious eyes. "You have good people working for you." "I do," Grant said, and the warmth in his voice surprised even him. He spent that day doing what he was good at. He found Decker, who was not difficult to find because men like Decker were rarely subtle, and had a conversation with him that was brief and uncomplicated in its clarity. Grant told Decker that he was aware of his presence and his purpose, and that any action he took against any person or property in Caldwell's Creek would result in his arrest and a stay in the county jail that would not be comfortable. Decker was a big man and a mean one, but he was not stupid, and he heard the weight behind Grant's words and left town that afternoon. When Grant came back to the house that evening, Clara had made supper. Real supper, not just cornbread but a proper meal, beans and salt pork and biscuits, using what she had found in his largely neglected pantry, and supplemented from the small kitchen garden that was beginning to yield again under her attention. She had lit the lamp on the table, and the kitchen looked, he thought, entirely different from how it had ever looked in the 4 years since he had moved into it. "Decker is gone," he said, sitting down. She exhaled slowly. "Good. For now," he said. "It doesn't mean Moss has given up." "No," she agreed. "It means he's reconsidering his approach." She served the beans and sat across from him. "How long do you think I can stay here before it becomes a problem for you?" He looked at her for a moment. The lamp made the kitchen warm and close, and the question hung in the air with more weight than she had probably intended to give it. "It's not a problem for me," he said. "People will start to notice," she said, not unkindly. "A woman living in the sheriff's house. People talk." "Let them talk," he said, which surprised her. He could tell. She looked at him carefully. "You don't mean that carelessly," she said. "I can tell when you say something carelessly and you haven't done it yet." He met her eyes. "No," he said, "I don't mean it carelessly." They ate in the silence that followed, which was not uncomfortable, and which carried in it something that had been building slowly for days without announcement, the kind of thing that grows in the space between two people when they are honest with each other more often than they are careful. On the 8th day, Martha Crane came to call. She arrived at the back gate in the early afternoon, a small, upright woman of about 50 with sharp eyes and a quality of practical concern that Clara recognized immediately as the kind that cannot be argued with. "I know she's here," Martha said without preamble when Clara opened the gate. "And I'm not here to make trouble. I'm here because I was a friend of Susan Calloway's, and I feel a responsibility toward anyone who has found shelter in this house." Clara blinked. "Susan Calloway." Martha's expression shifted slightly. "Grant hasn't told you." "There are things he hasn't told me," Clara said carefully. "He's a private man." "Susan was his wife," Martha said. "She died 4 years ago. Fever in the summer of 1878. She was 26. Martha paused. "It was very hard on him. He's been alone since." Clara thought about the photograph on the mantelpiece that she had looked at once and then deliberately not looked at again. She thought about the way the house had felt when she first came into it, clean but somehow unlived in, as if someone had been maintaining a space without inhabiting it. "I see," she said. "He's a good man," Martha said, as if this were the single most important piece of information she could convey. "This town doesn't always appreciate what it has in him. He keeps the peace, and he does it fairly, and he's never once taken advantage of the position." She looked at Clara with the assessing quality that Clara was beginning to recognize as simply what sensible women in this era did when they encountered new variables. "And you are Clara Jane," Clara said, "from Marston." "I know who you are," Martha said, not unkindly. "The whole town knows a young woman arrived in distress a week ago and that Grant put himself between her and Harlan Moss. What they don't know is where you've been staying." She paused. "I'd like to keep it that way. If you need anything, come to my boarding house. I'm on 3rd Street. You can come through the back." Clara was startled by the directness of the offer. "Why would you do that for me?" "Because what Moss is doing is wrong," Martha said simply. And because Grant is putting himself at some professional risk to do the right thing, and people who do the right thing deserve to have someone watching their back. She turned to leave and then turned back. The photograph on the mantelpiece is Susan. She was a lovely woman. She would have liked you, I think. She left before Clara could respond, which Clara suspected was intentional. That evening, Clara looked at the photograph properly for the first time. A young woman with a gentle face and light hair, standing beside a slightly younger Grant in front of what appeared to be this very house. He had the look of a man who did not yet know how much loss was ahead of him. She thought about what it meant to carry grief for 4 years in a house that contained a photograph of what you had lost, to go on getting up every morning and doing the work that needed doing. She thought she understood something about Grant Calloway that she had not understood before. She said nothing to him about it that evening. But when he came in, and she had coffee ready and the lamp lit, and he sat at the table with the automatic ease of a man who had stopped thinking about whether he was welcome, she thought about how different that ease had been a week ago, and how much she was responsible for the change. On the 9th day, Robert Jane arrived in Caldwell's Creek. Clara saw him from the kitchen window while Grant was at the office, watched her father tie his horse at the hitching post outside the saloon, and stand in the street looking lost and smaller than she remembered. He was 53 years old, and he had the appearance of someone who had been rapidly aging for 6 years, and had recently accelerated. She went out to him through the back route Martha had shown her, coming around the alley behind the general store, and met him in the street from the side rather than the front, so that anyone watching from the saloon would not see her emerge from the direction of Grant's house. Robert Jane saw her coming, and something in his face did something complicated and painful that she chose not to interpret until she was ready to. "Clara," he said. "Father," she said. They stood in the middle of the afternoon street, and the distance between them was not about the feet of space separating their bodies. "I was wrong," he said, without preamble, which surprised her. Robert Jane was not a man who admitted wrongness easily. "What I did was wrong. I knew it was wrong when I did it, and I did it anyway because I was afraid." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said. "I'm not asking you to forgive me immediately," he said, and she could hear that he had rehearsed this, which made it both more genuine and more painful. "I'm asking you to come home. Moss has agreed to take the ranch in full settlement of the debt and walk away from the marriage arrangement. The contract is apparently not legally binding, and he's decided pursuing it is more trouble than it's worth." He paused. "You can come home, Clara. The house is still yours for as long as I have it." She thought about this. "How long will you have it?" 6 months, he said. "Maybe less. Long enough for me to sort myself out, I hope. I've been writing to your Aunt Deanne in San Antonio. She has a room. You're going to leave Marston." "There's nothing left in Marston that's mine," he said. "And I can't live with what I almost did in the place where I almost did it." He met her eyes for the first time, and they were his old eyes, the eyes from before the fear had taken up permanent residence. "I'm sorry, Clara." She did not tell him it was all right because it was not entirely all right. But she reached out and took his hand and held it for a moment, which was what she had. She told Grant that evening, sitting at the table after supper with the lamp between them and the sound of crickets beginning outside. "Moss is leaving," she said. "He's taking the ranch and the debt and going." Grant was quiet for a moment. "That's because of Everett's letter from Austin. He knew the contract would fall apart in court, and he didn't want the fraud exposure." He paused. "And possibly because I had a conversation with Decker that made it clear the situation was becoming more trouble than it was worth." "You did more than you told me," she said. "I did what was necessary," he said, and she heard in his voice the particular quiet restraint of a man who does the work and does not need credit for it. I could go home, she said, for the time being, until my father leaves. The kitchen was very quiet. Yes, Grant said, you could. Neither of them moved for a moment. I don't particularly want to, Clara said, which was perhaps the most honest thing she had said in her entire life. Grant looked at her across the lamp, and whatever he had been carefully maintaining, that steady, appropriate, professional distance that he had been managing since the first night, she watched it shift. Not dramatically, not with any kind of announcement. Just a quiet settling, like a man who has been holding himself at attention for a long time finally allowing himself to relax. I don't want you to go, he said. It was plain as river water and just as clear. I've only known you for 9 days, she said. I know, he said. I'm aware of that. That's not a very long time. No, he agreed. It isn't. But I feel as though I know you, she said carefully, better than I know most people I've known for years. Is that strange? It might be that we've had somewhat accelerated circumstances, he said with a dryness that made her laugh. She laughed and he watched her do it, and there was in his expression something that she thought was wonder, or the beginning of it. Tell me about Susan, she said gently. He did not flinch from it. She had expected he might, that it would close him up, but he simply looked at the lamp for a moment and then at her. She was kind, he said. She grew up in Caldwell's Creek. We met when I first came here as a deputy before I became sheriff. She was 23 and I was 27 and we were married in the spring of 1877. He paused. She loved this house and she was going to make it something beautiful. She had plans, curtains she'd sewn, a garden. He paused again. She was sick for 3 weeks and then she was gone. I didn't change much of anything after because it felt wrong to, and then it started to just feel necessary, keeping things as they were. Clara reached across the table and put her hand over his. He looked down at it and then back at her. You kept the garden, though, she said. Badly, but you kept it. Something moved across his face that was very close to a smile. Badly is generous, he said. She turned his hand over gently in both of hers and held it, which she had not done deliberately. It just happened. The way things happen between people when the careful management of distance finally becomes more effort than it's worth. His hand was large and very still in hers, and he did not take it back. I'm not going home tomorrow, she said. I'll go and see my father in the morning and we'll talk properly, but I'm not ready to leave Caldwell's Creek. She paused. If that's acceptable. It's more than acceptable, he said, very quietly. She left before it became anything more than that, because they were both, she sensed, people who did things properly or did not do them at all. But she went back to the spare room and lay on the clean bed and felt something in the center of her chest that she had not felt in 6 years. Something that functioned like hope, but was warmer and more specific than hope generally was. Her conversation with her father the next morning was long and difficult and necessary. She sat with Robert Jane in the small back room of the hotel where he was staying, and they talked for 3 hours about her mother and the ranch and the years since, about the choices he had made and the fear that had driven them and the ways in which his cowardice had cost them both things they could not recover. She was honest in a way she had never allowed herself to be before, and he received it, not easily but without defensiveness, and she recognized that as its own kind of courage. She did not forgive him fully in one conversation because real forgiveness was not an event but a process, and she told him so. He accepted that too. "Who is the sheriff?" he asked before she left. He was perceptive enough to have noticed something in the way she had mentioned Grant's name once. "His name is Grant Calloway," she said. "He helped me when I arrived. He's a good man." Her father looked at her for a long moment. "You're staying for him." "I'm staying for myself," she said, "but he's part of why staying feels right." Robert Jane nodded slowly. "Your mother would have liked that," he said. "She always said you needed someone who was steady." Clara left him at the hotel and walked back through the morning streets of Caldwell's Creek, and thought about what it meant that this town had started to feel, in less than 2 weeks, more like somewhere she belonged than Marston had felt in 6 years. She stopped at the general store and spent some of her remaining money on seeds for the kitchen garden. The man behind the counter, a cheerful fellow named Peterson, asked if she was new to town, and she said she was, and he welcomed her with the genuine, uncomplicated warmth of someone who liked people on principle. She walked home, and she called it that in her head without thinking about it, and stopped on the back doorstep with the small paper packet of seeds in her hand, and understood that something had already been decided, even if she hadn't said so aloud yet. Over the following weeks, something grew between Clara and Grant with the inevitability of a thing that was always going to happen, but had needed exactly the right conditions to begin. She stayed in the house, which went from being a temporary arrangement to a natural state of affairs, with an ease that surprised neither of them. She began doing small things, not because she was obligated to, but because she wanted to, because the house deserved to be a home, and she found she had the talent for it that she had been suppressing for years. She repaired the curtains she found folded in the cedar chest that she asked permission to open. She planted the seeds from Peterson's in the kitchen garden. She began helping Martha Crane with the mending work she took in from the boarders, which gave her a small income of her own and a reason to leave the house daily and meet the people of the town. Grant watched all of this with a quality of careful attention that she eventually named correctly. He was making sure it was real and not performance, making sure she was building a life rather than occupying a space until something else presented itself. When he was satisfied that it was real, he stopped being careful about it and simply enjoyed it, which expressed itself in the way he came home in the evenings, not with the purposeful remoteness of a man returning to an empty house, but with the slightly different quality of a man returning to something. They talked every evening. He began teaching her to shoot. This had been her request, made with the practical firmness of someone who intended to be capable of protecting herself, and was done with the era of requiring protection from others. He taught her on the flat land behind the house, in the early evenings when the light was good, with a patience and precision that made her a good student rather than merely an enthusiastic one. She was a quick learner, and he told her so, without condescension. One evening in October, about 3 weeks after the confrontation with Harlan Moss, they were sitting on the back step of the house watching the last of the sunset paint the sky the color of embers, and Clara had her shooting lesson that had gone particularly well, and she was still feeling the clean satisfaction of having done a difficult thing correctly. "I'd like to stay here," she said, "in Caldwell's Creek, permanently." "I know," Grant said. "I'd like to find work," she said. "Proper work. Not just the mending with Martha. The schoolhouse needs a teacher, Martha says. The current one is leaving at the end of the term to get married. Mrs. Paulson," Grant confirmed. "She's moving to Houston." "I went to the county school in Marston through the age of 15, Clara said, "and my mother taught me further after that. I can teach." "I think you'd be very good at it," Grant said. She looked at him sideways. "You always say what you think." "Mostly," he said. "There are things I think that I'm more careful about." She held that for a moment. "Like what?" He looked at her, and in the failing light his face had an openness to it that she had been seeing more frequently. The expression of someone who has been closed for a long time and is remembering how to be otherwise. "Like the fact that I think about you a great deal more than is probably sensible," he said, with the plain directness that she had come to love about him. "Given that you arrived in difficult circumstances, and I was in a position to help you, and there are a dozen reasons why anything I might feel should be examined carefully for whether it's genuine." "Have you examined it carefully?" she asked. "For 3 weeks," he said. "Yes." She looked at the last light over the cottonwood trees. "And it's genuine," he said quietly. She turned and looked at him fully, and he looked back at her, and the evening held them both in the particular stillness of a moment that is on the verge of changing everything. "I think about you too," she said. "I think you're the most honest person I've ever met, and I think you're lonely in a way that I understand very well, because I've been lonely in the same way. And I think you deserve someone who chooses to be here rather than someone who has nowhere else to go." She paused. "I want you to know that I'm not staying because I have nowhere else to go. I have options now. My father would take me back, or I could go to San Antonio with him, or I could go to Austin, where Everett Holt apparently needs a secretary according to the letter you showed me." She held his gaze. "I'm staying because I want to be here, specifically here, with you." He looked at her for a long moment with those steady eyes that she had spent 3 weeks learning to read. Then he reached out and took her hand very carefully, the way you handle something that matters. "I'm glad," he said. "I am very glad." She laced her fingers through his, and they sat on the back step, while the sky went from ember to purple to the deep early winter dark, and neither of them said anything more because nothing more needed saying. The following Sunday he asked if she would like to walk with him, not the early morning creek walk, but a proper Sunday afternoon walk through the town, in full view of anyone who cared to notice. She understood what he was asking, and she said yes. They walked the length of Main Street and back in the clear October afternoon, and people noticed and people nodded and some people smiled. And Martha Crane, who was standing outside her boarding house when they passed, gave Clara a look of such warm and open approval that Clara felt a sudden rush of something that was almost like being known. In the weeks that followed, the town adjusted to the new reality with the pragmatic ease of a community that understands when 2 of its members have found something good. Clara interviewed for and received the schoolteacher position, which came with a small salary, and the use of the schoolhouse 3 days a week for the town's 11 children. She moved into the official status of permanent resident rather than temporary guest, which required the subtle renegotiation of certain domestic arrangements. Grant converted the parlor into a proper sitting room, something he had never bothered to do in 4 years, and Clara hung curtains in every room, not Susan's curtains, which she had refolded and returned to the cedar chest with the respect one owes to a history you didn't share. But curtains she had sewn herself from fabric she had chosen at Peterson's general store. The evening she hung the last pair in the bedroom window, she stepped back to look at them, and Grant appeared in the doorway and looked from the curtains to her. "It looks like a home," he said. "It is a home," she told him. He crossed the room and took her face in his hands with a gentleness that was absolutely characteristic, and kissed her for the first time, and she kissed him back, and it was exactly what she had come to expect from him, unhurried and certain and completely sincere. November arrived with cold nights and brilliant days, and the schoolhouse full of children who were surprised to discover that their new teacher could make arithmetic feel like a game and history like a story you were living. Clara proved to be exactly what Grant had said she would be, an exceptional teacher, which she knew because the children stayed after lessons to ask questions rather than racing for the door. She and Grant continued their evenings at the kitchen table, which had evolved from conversation into something more elaborate, a shared life in miniature, with all the small negotiations and discoveries that entailed. He was a man of fixed habits, and she had expected that to chafe against her own independence. But she found that his habits were not fixed by stubbornness but by practicality, and when she offered a reason to change something, he changed it without drama. He was, she discovered, genuinely funny in a very dry and understated way that ambushed her repeatedly because she never quite anticipated it. He was also occasionally infuriating, specifically in his tendency to underestimate how much rest he needed, and to come home from some difficult situation that had required 3 hours of hard riding across cold country, and simply sit down and drink coffee and decline to acknowledge that he was exhausted. She learned to read the signs of this and to address it directly. "You are going to sleep," she told him one evening in November, when he had come home from 2 days pursuing a horse thief through the hill country north of town, and had sat down with his coffee, looking as though he had been assembled from mismatched parts. "You are going to sleep now, and you will not argue with me about it." He looked up at her with an expression that contained amusement and exhaustion in equal measure. "I wasn't going to argue," he said. "You were preparing to say you just needed a moment," she said. "I was just going to have a moment," he said. "Bed," she said firmly. He went to bed, and she heard him asleep in approximately 4 minutes, and she sat at the kitchen table with her mending and her coffee, and felt the profound satisfaction of being necessary to someone who actually deserved to have someone be necessary to them. She wrote to her father every week. Robert Jane had indeed gone to San Antonio and was living with Aunt Deanne, and had, according to his letters, found work at a small export company that required careful accounting, which it turned out he was good at, having once been a capable ranch manager before the fear took over. His letters were brief and careful, not effusive, which was honest, but they were regular, which was what mattered. He asked about Caldwell's Creek, and she told him about the school and the town and the people, and she mentioned Grant with a frequency that she suspected told him everything he needed to know. In December, when the creek had a thin sheet of ice on its edges in the mornings and the cottonwood trees had shed their leaves, Martha Crane organized a Christmas gathering at her boarding house for the town's residents who had no family to spend the holiday with, which in Caldwell's Creek was a considerable number of people. Clara and Grant attended together as a matter of course, and Clara found herself in the middle of a room full of people who had come to know her over the preceding 2 months, who knew her as the schoolteacher who was good at her work and who lived with the sheriff, and who had come to town under difficult circumstances and had made a life from them. She stood at the edge of the room with a glass of punch and watched Grant across the gathering talking to Thomas and the deputy's wife about something that was making all 3 of them laugh. And she thought about how precisely and completely her life had changed in approximately 10 weeks, and how the change had come from the least expected direction, and had produced something far better than anything she had been managing to hope for before. Martha appeared beside her with the sixth sense for significant moments that seemed to be part of her fundamental nature. "You're happy," Martha observed. "I am," Clara said, honestly and without qualification. "He's happy too," Martha said. "He doesn't show it the way other people do. But I knew him for 4 years before you arrived, and I can see the difference." Clara looked at him across the room. "He lost so much," she said. "Yes," Martha agreed, "but that doesn't mean he wasn't supposed to find something new." She patted Clara's arm. "Susan would have agreed with that. She wasn't the kind of person who would have wanted him to be alone." Clara thought about Susan Calloway, whose photograph she had moved from the mantelpiece to the cedar chest with Grant's full knowledge and quiet gratitude, whose curtain plans and garden dreams she had in some sense inherited and honored in her own way. She thought that you could respect a history without being defined by it, that a house could hold the memory of one love and also make space for another, and that the 2 things did not diminish each other. In January, On a clear, cold Sunday afternoon, Grant took her back to the creek. They walked along the water in their winter coats with their breath making small clouds in the air, and the ice on the edges of the creek caught the thin winter sun and threw it back in pieces. He stopped at the place where they had seen the heron on their first walk, and he turned to face her, and he reached into his coat pocket and produced a small ring, plain gold with a single small sapphire, which she later learned he had ordered from San Antonio 3 weeks earlier because he wanted it to be right. "I know this is fast," he said. "By conventional measures, I know you arrived in this town in October with a stolen horse and a canvas bag and nowhere to go. I know that's not how these things are supposed to start." He looked at her with complete steadiness. "But I also know that I have been happier in the past 3 months than I have been in 4 years, and I know that's not a coincidence, and I know that what I feel for you is not circumstance or proximity. It's you, specifically you." He paused. "I would very much like to marry you, Clara. If you'll have me." She looked at the ring and then at his face, and she thought about the girl who had ridden through the dark 3 months ago with nothing but a canvas bag and a conviction that there had to be something better than what she was running from. "Yes," she said. "I will absolutely have you." He put the ring on her finger, and she grabbed the lapels of his coat with both hands and kissed him in the January cold beside the frozen, edged creek, while the cottonwood trees stood bare and white overhead. And she felt something in her chest that had been carefully folded up since her mother died open like a flower that has been waiting for exactly the right amount of light. They were married in March of 1883, in the small white church on the north end of Caldwell's Creek's Main Street, on a morning so clear and blue-skied that it felt like a personal endorsement from the weather. Martha Crane sat in the front row and wept in the magnificent way of someone who has been waiting for a happy ending and is fully committed to experiencing it properly. Thomas stood up with Grant, having been asked in a conversation that was brief and genuine, and had resulted in Thomas shaking Grant's hand for a long time without speaking. Clara's father came from San Antonio. He looked, she thought when she saw him at the church door, like a man who was putting himself back together. He was not entirely repaired, and she did not think he would ever be entirely what he had been before her mother died, but he was working at it, which was more than she had been able to say for 6 years. He walked her down the aisle, and she let him because it was true that she loved him, even with the full, complicated weight of what had happened between them, and because her mother would have wanted her to. Grant stood at the end of the aisle with the expression of a man who has been steady in the face of a great many things and has found, at last, something that makes the steadiness feel like it was always in service of something worth protecting. She reached him and took his hands, and they made their promises in front of the town they both called home, and she meant every word with the absolute conviction of someone who has chosen a thing freely and completely. The spring of 1883 brought the garden into its best form yet. Clara had expanded it through the winter, planning on paper with the systematic pleasure of someone who had always wanted a proper garden and had been given, at last, the time and space and permanence to create one. By April, the kitchen garden produced enough for their table, and enough left over to share with Martha, and with a widow named Helen Parsons who lived next door to the schoolhouse and had bad knees that made maintaining her own garden difficult. The town had, in the month since Clara's arrival and the subsequent weeks of her integration into its daily life, subtly expanded its sense of itself. The schoolhouse now had a small lending library, which Clara had organized with donations from residents who had books gathering dust in trunks, supplemented by a careful order from a bookseller in Austin. The children were reading more and better than they had before, which their parents noticed, and Clara's reputation as a teacher solidified into something the town took proprietorial pride in. Grant had been quietly managing a shift in the town's social fabric as well. There were two families of Mexican descent in Caldwell's Creek who had experienced a consistent low-grade exclusion from the town's community life. And Grant, who had grown up with an instinctive dislike of injustice in any of its forms, had been working steadily and without drama to change the terms of that exclusion. Clara, who shared his instincts in this and had the social fluency that his professional reserve sometimes made difficult, proved to be an effective partner in this work. By summer, the Reyes family and the Vasquez family were participating in the town's shared life in ways that felt natural and permanent. And Clara had two new friends in Maria Reyes and Lucia Vasquez, who were among the best she had ever had. In the autumn of 1883, Clara told Grant she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen, on a Tuesday morning before he left for the office. She had been carrying the knowledge for a week, waiting for the right moment, and then had decided that waiting for the right moment was something she was done with, and that any moment she chose would be the right one. He went very still for approximately 3 seconds, and then he crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and held her carefully, the way he held everything that mattered. "Are you well?" he asked, which was the first question and characteristically of him. "I'm very well," she said, into his chest. "I'm somewhat terrified and very happy, and I want you to know that I expect you to be both of those things too." "I am both of those things," he said, slightly muffled against her hair. He was, that evening, also visibly unable to sit still, which was so unprecedented and so endearing that she watched him pace the kitchen with genuine amusement until he caught her expression and stopped. "I'm pacing," he said. "You are," she confirmed. "I'll stop. I like it," she said. "It's the first time I've seen you not know what to do with yourself." He came and sat beside her and took her hand. "I am going to be an absolutely terrible nervous father," he said. "You are going to be wonderful," she told him, with the certainty of someone who has watched a man for the better part of a year and knows his character down to its foundations. Their son was born in May of 1884, in the house on the back street in Caldwell's Creek, in the bedroom with Clara's curtains in the window, and the early summer light coming through them in a warm, particular way. He arrived after a labor that lasted 12 hours, and that Grant spent largely in the kitchen in a state of controlled anxiety that expressed itself in the production of an extraordinary quantity of coffee that neither of them drank. Grant held his son for the first time in the afternoon of the day of his birth, sitting in the chair by the bedroom window with the summer light on both of them, and Clara watched from the bed and saw on his face something she had never quite seen there before, a quality of pure, uncomplicated joy that had nothing cautious or measured about it. "Hello, William," Grant said very quietly, as if there were a conversation beginning between them that was going to last a very long time. "He looks like you," Clara said. "He looks like you," Grant said. "The eyes." "He looks like himself," Clara said. "He's only been alive for 3 hours. We should let him be his own person." Grant looked up at her with that expression she loved, the slight crinkle at the corners of his eyes that was the architecture of the smile he usually kept mostly internal. 3 hours old and you're already defending his independence." "Someone has to," she said. The years that followed were the years of a real and specific life, not the imagined life that either of them had perhaps once thought they were supposed to be living, but the actual life, with all its ordinary texture and occasional extraordinary grace. Grant continued to be the sheriff of Caldwell's Creek, and Caldwell's Creek grew, as Texas towns grew in that era, with new families arriving and new buildings going up, and the railroad coming through in 1886, and changing the town's relationship with the wider world. Clara continued to teach, taking a brief interruption for William's first year, and then returning to the schoolhouse with the specific quality of energy that a person has when they return to work they genuinely love. She had, by 1887, expanded the school's curriculum to include basic science and geography, both of which required her to do considerable self-study, which she did with the same systematic pleasure that she brought to the garden. They had a second child in 1887, a daughter they named Alina, after Grant's mother, whose memory he had held quietly and carefully for many years without speaking of it, until Clara had, with patient gentleness, made a space in which he could. Alina was born with her mother's determination, and her father's steady eyes and a personality all her own, which expressed itself from approximately 6 months onward in a quality of absolute certainty about what she wanted and an extraordinary ability to make that certainty known. William, by this time 3 years old, regarded his sister with the thoughtful caution of someone evaluating a new development, and then concluded, by the time she was 3 months old, that she was interesting, which was the beginning of a friendship between the two of them that would last their entire lives. On a morning in the summer of 1887, Clara stood in the kitchen garden in the early light with her coffee, watching the way the garden had come, over 5 years, into exactly what she had planned and imagined and cared for it to be. The beans were coming in along the east fence. The herbs her mother had taught her the names of, rosemary and thyme and sage, grew in a neat row by the step. The roses she had put in the previous year were coming into bloom, not practical, not useful, purely beautiful, which she had decided she was allowed. Grant came out the back door and stood beside her with his own coffee in the early morning quiet before the children woke and looked at the garden. "It's something," he said. "It is," she agreed. "You did that," he said. "In 5 years you did that." "We did that," she said. "You built the new fence section in October. You were the one who dug out the old stump." "I did the physical labor," he said. "You had the vision." She looked up at him with the warm, precise knowledge of someone who has spent 5 years learning the specific texture of another person's character and finds it, still, genuinely fascinating. "We make a good team," she said. "We do," he agreed without qualification. Alina made herself known from inside the house at that point, with the particular clarion quality of a 9-month-old who has decided that the day should begin regardless of what the adults think. Grant handed Clara his coffee cup and went inside with the practiced ease of a man who has learned to move between the large and the small without treating either as more important than the other. Clara stood a moment longer in the garden in the early light, with the smell of rosemary and the sound of her husband talking to her daughter inside the house, and felt the weight and the warmth of a life that was fully, specifically hers. She thought about that night in 1882, the door crashing open and Harlan Moss's voice and the running and the dark, the horse pounding through 3 hours of Texas night with nothing ahead but uncertainty. She thought about standing in that street with her back against the hitching post and a man in a doorway who intended to own her. And then the other sound, the voice that had cut through it like something clean through something that wasn't. She thought about how close it had been. How easily the night could have ended differently. How many women it did end differently for, who had no creek to ride to, no stranger with a badge and a good character who happened to walk out of his office at the right moment. She was grateful. She was profoundly, specifically, daily grateful. Not in the passive way of someone who has escaped disaster, but in the active way of someone who has taken the escape and built something real from it, who has committed to the life that became available when the terrible thing didn't happen. She finished her coffee. She went inside, Grant was at the kitchen table with a leaner on his knee and William, who had materialized with the silent ubiquity of small children, standing beside them looking at a book that Grant had apparently been reading to them before Clara came in. They looked up when she came through the door, all three of them, with the same expression of welcome, and she thought, "Here it is. Here is the thing I was riding toward in the dark, though I didn't know it then." She sat down at the table and took her daughter from her husband's knee, and held her in the early light, and watched her son lean against his father's arm and listen to the house around them, full of the particular sound of people who belong together in a space that belongs to them. Harlan Moss had sold the Marston Ranch within a year of taking it in the debt settlement, and moved on to other ventures in other towns. He was not Clara's concern and had not been for years. Her father was well in San Antonio, had met a quiet woman named Frances at Aunt Deanne's church, and they were to be married in the fall, which Clara had learned in a letter that arrived the previous week, and which she had read to Grant over supper with a feeling of genuine, clean happiness for her father that she had not been certain she would ever be able to feel. Thomas had been made deputy sheriff of the neighboring county in 1885, and had taken his wife and their 2 children, and gone with the specific satisfaction of someone who has been given exactly the right kind of opportunity. Grant had recommended him without reservation. They still corresponded. Martha Crane continued to run her boarding house with the same sharp-eyed warmth she brought to everything, and remained the person in Caldwell's Creek whose opinion Clara valued most after Grant's. She had become, over the years, the kind of friend that Clara's mother had been, the kind whose directness was an act of love rather than an imposition. The schoolhouse had 7 new students enrolled for the coming September term, which would bring the total to 18, and would require Clara to think carefully about how to structure the day to manage the range of ages and abilities. She had been thinking about it already, had pages of notes, had spoken to a colleague in a larger town about methods. She was not done learning. She was not done growing. Neither of them were, which was perhaps the thing she was most grateful for, that they had not settled into the comfortable static of a life that was good enough but no longer moving. They still argued about pie. They still had conversations that started at supper and continued past midnight. Grant had recently become interested in irrigation methods for the county's farming community, and had been reading about it with the focused intensity he brought to things that engaged him. And Clara had been reading alongside him because it was interesting, and because she liked the particular quality of his mind when it was fully engaged with something. She put Alina down for her morning sleep and came back to the kitchen and sat beside Grant at the table and picked up her half-finished letter to a bookseller in Austin about the new order for the lending library. William looked up from his book. "Mama," he said. "Papa said the heron comes back to the creek every year." "He does," Clara said. "Can we go see him?" "This afternoon," Grant said. "After your lessons." William went back to his book with the satisfied expression of someone whose question has been answered satisfactorily. Clara looked at Grant across the table, over their son's head, and he looked back at her. And in the look was everything that had happened and everything that was still happening, the whole accumulated weight and warmth of it. And she thought about that first morning walk along the creek and the heron that had risen from the shallow water into the early light. She thought, some things take flight and come back. Some things find their way to exactly where they belong. She reached across the table and touched his hand briefly, just a touch, the kind that needs no explanation because it is itself the explanation, complete and sufficient. He turned his hand and held hers for a moment. "This afternoon, then," he said, "all 4 of us." "All 4 of us," she agreed. Outside the window, the garden moved slightly in the morning wind, and the roses that had no purpose but beauty leaned together in the way of things that have found, at last, the conditions under which they were always meant to grow.